Absolutely. Let's move to Ecuador now, I think. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
or
I think this is something that, we're trying with this project too, is to build those connections in at least, in the first step between like the US left and, left wing politics in Latin America. And like the first step is awareness. And we've been trying to cover what's been going on in Ecuador, right? And I would be very interested if you were able to, because I know a lot of our listeners are already familiar, but if you could give us, a brief history of Korea so we can understand the dynamics of this election, and then we can move into, Lenin, Moreno, and what happened there. And I always have to say, one of the great like ironies of history is that a man named Lenin, who it was not an accident, was purposefully named after Lenin, turned out to be such a traitor to like left wing movements. But we'll get to.
And yo, his name is Lenin Moreno, which would
Yeah.
translate to English as like the brown Lenin. Which holy shit, that sounds awesome, but evidently not. So yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, so yeah, so I'll try and be relatively brief here because Ecuador is a big. There's an escalating situation there right now,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So Rafael Correa was elected in 2007, right, on a anti-establishment, anti-IMF platform, right? Ecuador, like most countries in Latin America, like most countries in the third world, had a significant amount of debt to the IMF, right? Just
Mhm.
an odious amount of debt. Um, Rafael Correa, after he was elected in 2007, he was able to successfully reduce bondholder debt in Ecuador by literally arguing against the IMF in
Mm.
court and was successful. Um, so it put Ecuador on a path to economic growth, right? The economy grew a lot during Rafael Correa's term. It also put Ecuador on the path of regional integration. Rafael Correa associated himself with some people might call them the 21st century socialists or the Bolivarians, perhaps, right?
Mhm.
Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, and Nicaragua at the time. And this was important for a lot of reasons, right? I think when talking about Ecuador, another really important thing to think about is what is Ecuador, right? I think to people in the United States,
Mhm.
it's easy to look at Ecuador as, oh, yeah, it's that country, that's a small country on the equator, right? This is based, it's all Hispanics. It's obviously a lot more complex than that, right? Ecuador itself is a country with a deep indigenous history, right? Quito, the capital of Ecuador, was one of the historical capitals of a part of the Incan Empire, right? So there's a really deep indigenous culture there, and there's a really strong indigenous movement there as well. I think that's an important thing to think about because when Correa brought Ecuador kind of into this 21st century fold and embraced integration, right? It is no mistake that the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, which was like kind of like a regional bloc they were forming, was
Mhm.
capitaled in Quito,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
For historical reasons, for geographical reasons, things like that. And that's why I think it's important to remember for lefts in the United States. It might be easy to think that, oh, well, what does the United States care about Ecuador, right? Isn't Venezuela the golden goose, right? Ecuador was a crucial part of this
Mhm.
puzzle, which is why we're seeing kind of like I would describe it as a hit job that's going
Mhm.
on right now. But I guess we'll get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's important to like note, especially like with any potential, for example, of like South American integration, like how critical Korea was to that movement as well. To understand that it's not just like these aren't just like for leftists, for socialists who are listening to this. We're not just talking about like, okay, we want like our people in power because we want our people in power in every country. Like you have to understand like these were parts of historical movements that came really close to being able to implement a lot across not just their own countries, but the continent as a whole. And that's why we've been facing, you've been seeing what's been going, obviously what happened in Brazil with lawfare, and with Bolivia, like there's been all this, lawfare against these kind of left-wing candidates. And it's because they were very afraid of there being a cross-continental left-wing movement coming into power. And so let's get to this key figure here with Correa, though, too, because Correa's successor, Lenin Moreno, was supposed to continue this project. And then, as I'm sure you'll be able to explain eloquently, didn't, and then ended up becoming essentially a servant of neoliberal capital, most famously for most folks, betraying, Assange, um, as he did recently.
Which also I should have mentioned Assange too. That's probably one of the biggest things that Rafael Correa is notable for, giving Assange asylum. But yes, oh my goodness, if there's one big criticism, or if there's probably the biggest criticism I have of the Correa presidency, it's clearly not properly vetting your successors, right? Evidently. Here's the thing that I will say, I guess in Correa's defense here. Lenin Moreno, first of all, like we said, his fucking name's Lenin, right? That's just, come on. We assumed he was good. But Lenin Moreno, he ran as a Correísta, right? He ran his campaign as, no, I'm the successor, blah, blah, blah. That's how he ran his campaign. But as you described, he completely, to say he made a 180 like is almost an understatement. I have developed this conspiracy theory that Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, he either has Moreno's nudes or some sort of blackmail on him and was like, yeah, you're going to listen to us now. Like, it's amazing to me how much his reversal was. So what did Lenin Moreno do, right? I'd say probably like the word I use that I think is most effective in describing Lenin Moreno is betrayal, right? Betrayal of Julian Assange, as you just described, right? Bowing to the U.S. pressure and saying, yeah, okay, cool. We don't really care about Julian Assange anymore. We'll remove his asylum. Betraying the people by accepting a $10 billion IMF loan, right? Which was particularly egregious to the Ecuadorian people since literally, like I said, Correa's his biggest claim to fame was negotiating down the bondholder debt of the IMF, right? So to see Lenin, and we saw this with the Bolivian coup government too, right? What was one of the things they did before they left? Oh, give us an IMF loan so we can make sure the leftists can't do anything with the economy. Though they returned that, but that's a whole nother thing. So it was particularly egregious for the Ecuadorian left to see Lenin Moreno doing this for many reasons. Now, what the acceptance of that loan did lead to was a massive protest uprising in Ecuador in late 2019, right? It was late 2019. And it was because Lenin Moreno had declared the abolition of fuel subsidies, which this was something that the IMF was requesting. Massive protests broke out in Ecuador, massive protests backed by the indigenous social movements. It was so bad for Lenin Moreno that he literally had to flee the capital and go to Guayaquil on the coast, right, one of the coastal cities, because they were literally afraid that Quito was going to fall to I guess an indigenous revolution, right? Wow. So Lenin Moreno had to backtrack, right, luckily, and did at least on the fuel subsidies, right? But that to me was the beginning of the end of the Lenin Moreno regime, right? And the beginning of the resurgence of the Ecuadorian left because of that massive protest movement. That was when you first saw, or not first saw, but that was the beginning of kind of the prominence of people like Yaku Perez, who I know we're going to be talking about, and Patrick Kudik, and obviously Andres Arauz and the Correistas as well. But when I think about Lenin Moreno, I go back to that one word, betrayal. Like, yeah.
Yeah, and I highly suggest, I listened to a really good interview with Guillaume Long, who was in the Correa government as well, that he did with Grace Blakely, who we've had on the show as well. And it was talking about the successes of the Correa movement. But one thing that we've been doing on this show, and I think it's really important that we start to do as like a global left, is take stock of what happened with what we could maybe call like left populism, right? Because the Correa movement was really exciting because it was very left wing and it was moving a lot of, social programs that were very much needed, but it did have a kind of like big tent appeal, right? And as Long was saying, in his discussion with Blakely, it's not a condemnation of like what was done and what was achieved. It's like the lessons that you learn, that when you create a big tent, that you also are even including some people who have like economic interests that are, opposed to the workers. And you have a lot of people who want to come into the movement because like, oh, this is the party that's in power. So if I want to come into power, this is the group that I need to attach myself to. You have to, like, I think one of the biggest lessons that we're learning for like left-wing parties across the globe right now is making sure that they're not just to borrow the phrase from Leo Panish, who's somebody we've been talking about a lot on the show too, aren't just class focused, but class rooted. But anyways, we could put a pin on that till later, because I really wanted to talk about, the election that's going on right now, because it does seem like we could see a resurgence of the Correa project, but there have been some very, very, honestly, to be frank, strange accusations that we've been seeing, and potential alliances between, an indigenous left and, more right-wing candidates there as well. So,
Sure. Yeah. So it's, to say the situation is complicated is an understatement, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing that I emphasize with this situation, this election. It's not black and white, right?
Yeah.
It is not one layer of it is black and white.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first thing to point out and be very clear about is that since day one, when this election was, when people were gearing up for this election, the right wing has tried to sabotage the Correistas since day one. They successfully banned Rafael Correa from running for vice president because he was supposed to be on the ticket with Andres. They banned, I think, two different political parties that they tried to register as until they were finally able to register as the Union for Hope, right? So they've been under attack from the electoral or from the government in Ecuador from the beginning. So I think that's very important to point out. Despite all that, Andres Arauz was polling well and was favored to do really well because of how bad of a job Lenin Moreno has done, right? Or had done, right? I, perhaps riding on the wave of optimism from Bolivia, right? Because of how inspiring that was. I thought it was a shoo-in that Andres was going to win in the first round. I thought it was a guarantee. I thought it was, oh yeah, this is going to be in the bag. I think more and more I'm very disturbed when I think about this super secret meeting that Lenin Moreno had with Luis Almagro, the head of the OAS, a week before the election, right? That's a little disturbing to me, for obvious reasons. I think about, and granted, this is an election under COVID, so I understand it, but I think about the long voter lines. I think about kind of the different voter suppression tactics that clearly took place in Ecuador. But with all that said, I think it's also important to point out that election observers have clearly stated time and time again, there was no fraud, right? There was no actual election fraud, right? Now, I think that's extremely important to point out because of how the situation has kind of developed, which is on election night, as Andres was polling, or was the results were filtering in, and Andres was clearly in the lead and getting close to maybe avoiding the runoff, but it was seeming more and more that there was going to be a runoff. Initial reports were showing that Yaku Perez, who was the candidate from the indigenous Pachakutik party, might end up actually going into the runoff with Andres Arauz, which was particularly surprising to a lot of people, right? He kind of like an insurgent. Yaku would describe himself as an insurgent environmentalist candidate, but we'll go into that in a second here. Yaku Perez was looking to get ahead of the neoliberal candidate Guillermo Lasso, who they were neck and neck, though. They were neck and neck for second place to see who was going to go into the runoff against Andres. The election observers that I know, the people I know in Ecuador, who I'm going to have to shamelessly plug the Machete y Mate interview that we did with one of the election observers. The election observers I know in Ecuador told me, literally before the results were even coming out, they told me, according to their data, they are very confident that Lasso is going to pull ahead of Yaku Perez because the coasts come in late, right? Yaku Perez having a lot of support in the highlands, right? Since that's where the indigenous are. From before anything even happened, they were telling me this, right? Because it was clear just from the data. So when Lasso ended up pulling out ahead of Yaku Perez kind of toward the end there, it wasn't surprising to me. It wasn't surprising to anybody who was actually following. But Yaku Perez claimed fraud, right? And is continuing to claim fraud. So I think it's really important to think about and ask ourselves, who is Yaku Perez and who are Pachakutik, right? Because I think those are really important questions here. And I think they should be differentiated, right? I think for me, I'm going to be completely honest. Everything I've seen tells me that Yaku Perez is an opportunist, that Yaku Perez is a fraud. Yaku Perez never saw a right-wing coup that he didn't support. Yaku Perez never saw a left-wing government that he didn't call uniquely corrupt, right? Now, because I believe Yaku Perez is an opportunist, do I believe that Pachakutik and the social movements behind him are opportunistic? No, certainly not. Certainly not. Pachakutik was the party that Yaku Perez ran with, was founded in 1995 as essentially the political party arm of CONAE, right? What is CONAE? CONAE is the Confederation of Indigenous Organizations in Ecuador, right? This is essentially the indigenous lobby for all intents and purposes.
Mhm.
CONAE has existed since the mid 80s and has a reputation in South America as one of the most militant, one of the most well-disciplined, one of the most well-organized indigenous organizations on the whole continent, right? So CONAE they're an amazing, once again, an amazing disciplined group of people, environmentalists, plurinationalists, socialists, right? They've always embraced socialism. I think after the 2019 protests, right, where Yaku Perez kind of gained in prominence, that was one of the biggest reasons that he was kind of able to get enough support within Pachakutik to run for president, right? I think another thing to point out that's really important, which is kind of twofold here, is that one, Pachakutik is indigenous. Pachakutik does have a base in the indigenous communities. That does not mean that Andres Arauz and the Union for Hope don't, right? They also have a strong indigenous consistency. They also have a strong indigenous base. They're also plurinationalists, which is why I think Andres Arauz himself has had some of the best rhetoric or the best responses to all of this, right? Which is Andres Arauz has consistently tried to make overtures to Pachakutik and Yaku Perez, or at least in the early stages when things were not as frosty, I guess, or as hot, I should say, as they are now. Andres consistently would say, I think we should be celebrating that the Ecuadorian people voted 70% in favor of plurinationalism and 70% against neoliberalism, right? Basically saying, hey, Pachakutik, Yaku Perez, we are natural allies. Like, how can you possibly even consider going into coalition with the neoliberals and with Guillermo Lasso? Which is why the second thing I think is important to point out when thinking about Pachakutik and CONAE is that they're divided on this, right? There is raging debate internally over how to orient themselves toward the runoff, right? Because the indigenous communities, they're not stupid, right?
Yeah.
They don't need academics or US leftists or whatever saying to them, oh, well, actually, you don't know this. This is how things are supposed to be. They know what's happening, right? They're aware of the situation. And the radical sectors within CONAE have been very public in saying, no, we will not coalition with Guillermo Lasso. That's not going to happen. So I think those are really important things to point out. And like I said, fundamentally, it's not black and white. It is a very nuanced situation.
No, and I really appreciate you, doing that work to disentangle, for example, Perez and like the indigenous movements, because I think that it's that conflation between the indigenous movements and Perez in general has led to some kind of like sloppy analysis from even like left wingers who are trying their best to understand the situation. Like, I just have to say, like people should be like aware that like Perez, this is somebody who like celebrated when Lula was thrown in prison. This was somebody who celebrated the coup against Evo Morales, right? This is not somebody, who is just like against Correa or like some very specific like Ecuadorian case. This is somebody who is adamantly against left-wing governments, regardless if they are people like Lula or people like Evo Morales, right? And I think that that's an important thing to note. I want to make sure that we don't miss this part of it as well, because the reason that we're fixating on this is because all of these claims of fraud only amplify and the possibility of some kind of intervention, be it clandestine or overt, against a return to for Arauz to win the election. And I also want to note, Moreno is continuing his neoliberalization of the country of Ecuador. He is continuing to try to privatize more and more of the state bank in Ecuador, right? Which is increasingly damaging. So if you're able to basically push this election down the line, like they were successfully able to do in Bolivia, you can do a lot more damage and continue to privatize more and more and more of the country to implement that agenda, essentially, through some another form basically of lawfare. Like if they're able to continuously hold these results like in the courts or something like that, that's something that's extremely dangerous. So it's like the role that Perez is playing right now, even if they don't end up aligning themselves with the right wing in the runoff election, they are doing a lot of groundwork for people who want to do a lot of damage in Ecuador.
Absolutely. And I'll steal a quote that I referenced an interview that my podcast did with an election observer. He said from his perspective on the ground, it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? Obscure the process. Oh, well, there was fraud. Oh, well, there's also voter suppression, which is legitimate, right? Obscure, obfuscate things, because you're exactly right, David. To me, that's their intention. Delay the election. That's what they're trying to do. Either get Arouse off the ticket entirely, right? I think that's literally what they're trying to do by accusing Arouse of being in bed with Colombian guerrillas, which, holy hell, that's a whole
Did you hear
thing.
about the bird thing with that? Sorry.
I did. Yeah. That's amazing. What is it? Like a bird analyst said that the bird in the super secret guerrilla video wouldn't even be in Colombia. Like,
yeah, exactly.
And bro, here's what's amazing. That's just the typical kind of clown show shit that I expect from the right wing in Latin America, right? Like that's the kind of shit they'll do. Just, hey, Arouse, he's actually getting paid by guerrillas that were financed by the Progressive International. Just the most outrageous shit that no rational human being would ever even contemplate. But I do worry. That they're going to. I don't know if they'll be successful in getting Andres off the ballot, right? Because he literally came in first by almost 10 goddamn points, right? I think they're gonna keep trying to push to delay it. We'll see what happens, but it's definitely a situation that people gotta keep their eyes on because that's what they're gonna try to do. They're already trying.